Welcome to our weekly On Politics show. I'm your host, Greg Borowski, and we have a very full show for you today. We're going to start with a discussion taped earlier this week between James Causey and Christian Schneider that focuses on our violent spring and in particular what can be done about it. Next, we'll look at a hot-button proposal making its way through the legislature to eliminate the state's 48-hour waiting period for handgun purchases. Why now, and does it really matter anymore? Mary Spicuzza will take the lead on that along with Dan Bice. Then we'll take a quick look at the latest fallout from the scandal at the VA in Toma, particularly as it relates to Senator Tammy Baldwin. Then we'll be joined by Craig Gilbert to dig into the latest on Scott Walker's not yet official, but everyone knows he's running presidential campaign. And finally, we'll take some reader questions. If you are already in the queue, and please send along more that we'll get to before the show is over. But now we'll get things started by going back in time to Tuesday when we taped a discussion on violence and crime in the city of Milwaukee that was taped with James Causey and Christian Schneider. All right, we're here today to talk about the violence in the city of Milwaukee. We're going through another violent spring with many more homicides than normal, and there's been no disagreement that this is a big problem. There has been a lot of disagreement around what should be done about it and who's really to blame. We're here today with James Causey, an editorial page columnist, and joined from Madison by Christian Schneider, another editorial page columnist, and we want to talk about that. And let's just start with James. What is your take on what's happening out there, and what should we do about it? We have to do something.
Well, what's going on is that a lot of people are being shot and a lot of people are dying. We know that. What can be done about it? Well, the mayor and the police chief, they came in and they talked to us, and they're doing a media sweep about what should be done. And quite honestly, I'm a little disappointed because their solution is put more police out there, more police overtime, and stricter gun laws. I think I would like to hear something more. And I think we need to look at violence as a public health issue. And what I mean by that is if 49 or 50 kids at Marquette University came down with the whooping cough or any kind of disease, you would have public health officials come in and inoculate the disease, find out what happened, and try to cure everybody that's there and prevent the disease from spreading. I think we need to take the same type of approach when it comes to violence. We can't police ourselves out of this problem. We can't have another gun law that will be like the silver bullet to fix this issue. But we have to look at it as a public health crisis.
Christian, what's your take on that? I mean, is that the right way to look at it, or is there something much more concrete to look at in terms of who's in charge and what are they up to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the mayor's response to this has actually been pretty weak. I mean, he's been out there blaming the legislature for passing concealed carry and those things, I think that's ridiculous. The numbers I don't think support it. I mean, between 2013 and 2014, there was actually a drop of I think 17% in murders in the city, and that was after concealed carry had already passed. So. I don't think the numbers actually support that, and maybe it's his prerogative to try to pass the blame to somebody else, but that's clearly what he's doing. I mean, the problem with the inner city, as I see it, and James can obviously speak to this more, but I mean, there are just so many links in the chain, and it's so cyclical, where you have poverty that creates crime, that creates single families, that creates a bad education system, which then creates poverty, which creates crime, which creates all this stuff. And so it's just kind of, it runs in a cycle. At each entry point kind of into the cycle, there's pushback and there are trade-offs. So, I mean, that's I think what frustrates everybody is the fact that there's really no good answers.
Well, is this, I mean, to go back to James, is this, and both of you, is this a case where it's a problem where we don't have the right laws on the books? Is it a problem with enforcement of the laws? Is it more a personal responsibility and a community-based thing? Can we even agree on where what's the source of the problem, or is it all of the above?
Well, it's all of the above and more. I mean, you need to throw poverty, you need to pour segregation, racism, and everything else and mix it all into a bowl because it's all of that stuff. And the problem happens when we try to say, if we fix this one thing, everything else will fall into place. Well, don't get me wrong, Chris. I I sort of disagree with you about the gun laws. I do think that there are too many guns in the central city. I think there are too many bad people with guns who use those guns to commit crime in the central city. And they need to learn a lesson that I can't run around here firing off a gun and I'm already a felon and putting other people's lives in danger. They need to get the message that they can't continue to do this. And so I do understand how, and I would support a mandatory minimum for someone who is a felon in possession of a gun. However, there are so many other things that I wish that they will look into to address this problem.
Where is the breakdown right now in terms of, what, if we know where the spot or where the breakdown is, maybe that's where you go to try to attack it and make a quick difference.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little more skeptical of James that increased gun laws would actually make a difference. I mean, you saw in the shooting, the tragic shooting last week after the car accident, that the guy that had the gun was a felon that wasn't supposed to have the gun. So I mean, there's already laws on the books to keep people from having firearms. So I don't think an increased law is really going to make all that much difference. I just think they ignore the law altogether. As far as jobs, it's funny coming from the conservative perspective that earlier this year a group of Republicans came and they had a proposal to have these enterprise zones where in the most impoverished part of the city there would be areas where there aren't any taxes on businesses and there's right to work and all that kind of stuff to try to boost jobs in those areas. And they were immediately attacked from people within the city saying, well, these white Republicans come in here and try to mess with us and now they're interested. And so I think a lot of Republicans just say, look, if we're going to get attacked for trying to help things, why bother? And in the process, Tom Barrett's just going to keep getting elected, and all the people in Milwaukee are just going to keep electing the same people and have the same problems, I think.
If I could piggyback off of that, though, the problem with that is that they elected to do this by themselves, and they did not include everyone at the table so they could figure out, will this work or not? I mean, you can't just come up with ideas in a vacuum and say, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to try this, and without hearing what the other side has to say. That's what worked with teen pregnancy. That's why that was successful. That's why we were able to get the numbers down, because we brought everybody to the table and we said, it doesn't matter if you're a liberal or you're a conservative, what we have to do is fix this problem, so come and sit down at this table and let's talk about it. You just can't say, oh, we're going to try this and we don't care if you listen or not, but let's see if this works. We've been trying that for years, for decades, and this is and look at how far we've gotten because we've been trying things that way. We haven't been able to move the needle, and the only way it's been moving is downward. So, and that's a bad thing. So we have to figure out a way to get people at the table talking and trying to fix this problem.
Well, unfortunately, I think we're out of time, and unfortunately, I'm sure we'll be able to talk about this many more times as we go forward because the issue isn't going to quickly go away. So thanks, Christian, and thanks, James, for joining us.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, we're back live now, so don't be confused. That wasn't the quickest wardrobe change in history. We're back now with Mary Spicuzza and Dan Bice, and we're going to talk a bit about the gun measure in Madison. We hear a lot about optics in politics these days. So we've got, on the one hand, a very violent spring in Milwaukee, and over in Madison, they're saying, let's eliminate this waiting period. What's behind this move, and what's the effect, Mary?
So they actually started circulating this bill a couple of months ago before this spike in shootings that occurred in Milwaukee. But basically, Republican lawmakers are calling this a time tax, saying someone who wants to buy a gun from a federally licensed dealer has to wait 48 hours from the time they want to purchase it, and they go in, and then they have to go back to the store or wherever they're buying it. So they're saying this is a tax on their time, that background checks now are much faster than they used to be. They typically take often about an hour or so, and that they're saying now this time tax, this 48-hour waiting period is obsolete, and it should be more instantaneous, like as soon as the background check
Well, there's clearly a
clears.
political element too. The representatives of Milwaukee are Democrats, and they don't have control of the Assembly or the Senate. So the people pushing it are Republicans, mainly ones from the suburban areas or from rural Wisconsin. So, I mean, that's obviously a factor. You have heard almost nothing from the from the Milwaukee delegation or from Madison on this.
Well, a lot of Milwaukee Democrats are saying that this should not be a priority. I know Senator Fred Risser, a longtime state lawmaker, is saying, he basically is calling the 48 hours a cooling off period and saying if there is, say, a domestic violence incident, what's wrong with having somebody wait 48 hours before they can buy a gun? Republicans then are saying, well, if there's, say, a woman who's been battered and gets a restraining order, shouldn't she be able to go and buy a gun in case her husband?
Isn't this the case though where the laws are just haven't kept up with the technology, that it doesn't take 48 hours anymore to do it, and most people aren't going to be going.
There's
to
there was
violence
a cooling off period too, that if you got angry you could run out and get a gun, and so this would keep you from doing something rash. I mean, that's another element of it. So if this passes, it's almost certain that the governor's going to sign this, right?
Right, and it's almost certain to pass because Republicans control both houses. It's already cleared one house. And Governor was just talking about this at an NRA event, touting this as something that he supports. So I don't think there's any question that he'll sign
So
it.
there is one other interesting element that's coming out just now, and Jason Stein will be posting a story about this afternoon, and that is in 1994 the governor had pushed legislation to require, as part of the background check, that you check someone's juvenile record. And so the Democrats are bringing this up to say, well, he supported gun control before he opposed gun control, and some of the other Republican campaigns are saying that he might not be as strong on gun measures, and he shouldn't be getting the support he is from the NRA that he's getting now because of this. But just yesterday he defended his support for this legislation.
But the juvenile part, that is covered, correct?
If you buy a gun from a federally licensed dealer, they have to do a criminal background check. His bill expanded that to say that they would have to check your juvenile record to see if you had any criminal offenses back then.
Okay, we're going to shift topics to the Toma VA scandal and the issues there with the drugs and the whistleblower. I know you've been front and center on this, Dan, in terms of breaking news, and I know you have
I've been interested in the
break.
political side of it, mainly.
Tell us about it.
Well, there are two sides to it. There are the problems with the over-prescription of drugs to veterans at the Toma VA Center, and then there's been the political fallout, because there were whistleblowers who came forward, complained about this, and almost nothing happened until news stories started appearing. And the question with Senator Tammy Baldwin, is who is at fault for the fact that her office did nothing with these whistleblower complaints? And in January, she fired her deputy director of constituent services, someone named Marquette Baylor, and placed much of the blame on Marquette for what happened there, that her office had received these complaints and supposedly did nothing. Well, this past week, Marquette's filed a complaint with the Senate Ethics Committee saying actually this is part of a cover-up, that they did do much, but the chief of staff and possibly Senator Baldwin did know about this and didn't do anything in response. So they're asking the Senate Ethics Committee to investigate why she was fired and whether this was part of some sort of cover-up.
And you wrote a little bit about that earlier in the week, but you have more information you're planning to write about today?
Right. I'm writing a story today on how much this has cost Senator Baldwin so far. It's cost her about $45,000 to do an internal review, which led her to justify the firing and to demote another staff member and to dock the pay for her chief of staff.
Is she paying that with her campaign funds?
Yeah, it's with her campaign funds that she's doing this.
And it sounds like she has some pretty high-priced lawyers that you were talking about that work.
Marquette Baylor, well, actually both sides have
Both
pretty
sides, yeah.
high-priced lawyers. Marquette Baylor, the former staffer, has a former U.S. attorney from Kansas City who's very active in Republican circles representing her, even though she's been active here as a Democrat. And on Tammy Baldwin's side is a guy named Mark Elias, who's now working on the Hillary Clinton campaign. So you have two very high-powered law firms representing and active in this. And the Kansas City firm had been active here on the John Doe case. They were representing Wisconsin Club for Growth and Eric O'Keefe.
I want to bring in Craig Gilbert, who's our Washington bureau chief, and he's live from Washington. Now, Tammy Baldwin's not up again for re-election until 2018. You know, if a week can be a lifetime in politics, there's a whole lot of evolution between now and 2018, but Talk a little bit, Craig, if you could, about the Marquette Law School poll last week. We got some indication of where Tammy Baldwin sits with the voters, and what's your sense of all this?
Well, I mean, one interesting takeaway from the poll is that there's not really any clear evidence that it's hurting her with the electorate in general. I mean, her numbers are kind of where they've been, where they were 2 years ago. They're a little better than they were when she got elected, and they're a little worse than they were last summer. But basically about 40% of registered voters like her, and about 40% don't, and the rest don't have an opinion. So we haven't seen an effect in the polls yet, but that's not to say this won't be an issue that's used against her when she does come up for re-election in 2018. That's a midterm election cycle, so it'll be a challenging cycle for her because Democrats don't do as well in midterm elections.
Okay. Speaking of elections, let's switch to the more immediate campaign, which of course is Scott Walker and his presidential run. Now, today he's in Minnesota. I guess tomorrow, this weekend, he's in Iowa. He was spotted in Appleton yesterday.
And he might be anywhere else.
We
We
don't
have
know
no
where
idea.
It's probably in one of the key states, though. Craig, you had a story this morning about sort of the balance that the governor is trying to seek or has to seek between his approval ratings at home and what he's promoting nationally. Talk a little bit about how he's doing or what sort of the pitfalls he faces are.
Yeah, there have been 3 Wisconsin polls this spring, and in each one of them, his numbers are down significantly, and they're negative, in negative territory. I mean, the Marquette poll, 41% approve, 56% disapprove. I mean, one of the remarkable things about his numbers in the 3.5 years that Marquette's been polling since the beginning of 2012 is how stable they've been. I mean, they hardly ever change. I mean, he's so polarizing, and people are so divided over him that his approval rating's always, somewhere between 46% and 51%. So this poll was kind of shocking in that regard. I mean, a lot of people expected his numbers to go down. He's not in the state as much to defend himself. He's got a controversial budget. He's running for president. That can come with baggage. So it'll be really interesting to watch going forward whether he can bounce back once the budget is over from these numbers. But the risk is that, he's going around to Republican primary voters bragging and touting his record of political success in a swing state as a conservative governor. And when his numbers are underwater, I think that has the potential to undermine that message.
So some of Walker's people today were saying this is just simply a result of the fact that he's less visible in Wisconsin. Do you think that's a factor or not?
Yeah, I think, so what's changed since his numbers were better, the presidential campaign and the budget. And so it looks like it's some combination of the budget, which is not popular in these polls. And yes, he's out of state, so he's not around to kind of defend himself. There's also the sort of perception that he's not here spending 100% of his time governing, which is potentially a negative because he's running for president. And also, he's running for president, he's playing to conservative Republican primary voters around the country. And so, he's saying things and taking positions that may not appeal to the sort of voter in the center of the Wisconsin electorate the way they do to conservative grassroots Republicans and activists.
It seemed like there were 2 main stories about Walker in Wisconsin media, one being where is he and do we know where he is, and the second one is what part of his budget's being rewritten or being deleted. But there's actually a third one, and I'm wondering, you're talking about the effect of his Wisconsin numbers on his national run, but his national run has an effect here, not just in the fact that he's not around and he's might not be seen as governing, but he's had these issues where he's flip-flopped on several issues: the immigration issue and the ethanol issue, a number of those things that aren't issues here, but it doesn't look very good for him to be changing positions on some of these things.
Yeah, and I think there's several aspects to that. One, as you said, is cases where he's flip-flopped, like immigration and ethanol. Even right to work, which he didn't change his position on, but went from saying he didn't want it to come up to signing the bill. So, there's the effect of seeing him change his rhetoric on some of these issues. There's also the fact that he's being forced to talk about issues that he's not all that well versed and experienced at talking about, like foreign policy, and also moving to the right on some issues. So all those things, it's not just his absence, as you said. It's kind of sort of how he's defining and how he is trying to define himself in a Republican presidential campaign and how that plays back home.
Well, let's talk about one of those issues. Mary, you had a story earlier this week about, and we've heard about Walker's shifts on illegal immigration, and then this week there's discussion about legal immigration and foreign folks who are coming here to fill key jobs and things like that. What did he say, and how did that kind of get him a little mixed up with the rhetoric?
Yeah, he's been criticized for flip-flopping on illegal immigration, but in the wake of that, he has now twice talked about limits to legal immigration, and he didn't specifically come out with a policy proposal, but raised this issue or the suggestion that maybe we need to limit legal immigration and look how it's affecting American workers and American wages. And really, I've not heard any other 2016 presidential contenders talking about limiting legal immigrations. Senator Jeff Sessions has been into that and talking about how it's hurting the American economy, but really nobody else from 2016 crowd has gone there. And it's gotten a lot of pushback. A lot of conservatives want to see immigration reform. The Koch brothers support immigration reform and certainly legal immigration. A lot of conservative think tanks want to see legal immigration expanded and want to see reforms to the immigration system. So it was a bit surprising.
He seems to be flailing on the immigration issue because he's been all over the place. And if you remember, initially he blamed a reporter for his changing positions, and now he acknowledges he's changing positions, and he seems to be changing positions, all of the time.
Well, I've long thought that, campaigns function in sort of a predictable way. It's just that we don't always know what they know. But so why would this come out as an issue? Craig, do you have any thoughts on why would he even bring it up?
I don't think he's really trying to make news on immigration. I think this is just things he's saying and how they're being perceived and the attention they're getting. I mean, after this surge he had early on, which was a boon to him, particularly to his fundraising. I mean, he's in pretty good position right now in the Republican race. He's got the potential that a lot of other candidates don't have to appeal across some of these dividing lines within his party. He's got this great, shorthand story about all the times he's gotten elected and defeating labor in Wisconsin. So he's actually in a phase where he's not really trying to be in the media all the time. He doesn't need to be right now. But it happens, and immigration's a case where he didn't have a, highly developed positions, and I think for a while he was kind of trying to be all things to all people. So, he's playing with fire a little bit here, both in terms of how people react to his particular position as it evolves on immigration, and also just the perception of kind of not handling that particular issue well and shifting his ground, and that's a storyline that he doesn't want to see reinforced as the campaign goes on.
There's a second issue too, that over the years he's loved talking to the media and the press, but his campaign is trying to pull back and control what he's saying. So you have those two things going on. He does like getting out there and likes talking about whatever issue he's being asked about. I wanted to get back to your story, the story you did today, and a question that kept on running through my mind as I was reading it, and that is, do you think that a voter in, say, South Carolina or New Hampshire, do you think do they care about what his approval ratings are in Wisconsin? Do you think?
I think that, not necessarily, but I do think that when you talk to people, activists who are reacting to Scott Walker, these are people outside the state of Wisconsin, people who are kind of warming to him, or, the things they know about him they like. I mean, one of the things they like about him is this narrative about, here's a guy from a swing state who was a very aggressive conservative and made it work politically, winning 3 elections in 4 years. And he's going around telling people that, conservatives can be bold and they can appeal to not only Republicans, but they can also appeal to independents, because independents like bold leaders. Well, that story is, I think, less persuasive when you're struggling at home politically. So, if his numbers bounce back in the next few polls, no problem. But if he finds himself in a position like Chris Christie's in New Jersey, where he's got, it's a lingering issue in terms of his standing in the state, I think it just makes it harder to sell his electability, not necessarily his agenda, but his electability to some of these party insiders.
Well, let's hear on that electability question. You hear sometimes about the primary and the primary before the primary, and this is the primary before the primary before the primary, but the Koch brothers primary, there was this indication earlier in the week that the conservative Koch brothers, who are often spend quite large sums on Republican candidates, thought Walker was the best choice. And then they sort of walked that back a little bit. What's to be made of that?
You know, I think it's a good signal for Governor Walker. I think it was David Koch who left a fundraiser. He made some comments privately and then confirmed them publicly. He later walked them back and said, well, I'm not endorsing anybody yet. But I feel like that was clearly a signal that they were saying, you know, we see this guy as being the guy to beat Hillary Clinton.
It's more than a signal.
Yeah.
He said that.
Yeah.
I mean, he actually told the New York Daily News that if Republicans get out, he thinks that Walker will clean her clock. That's what he said.
And Governor Walker said he was surprised by their comments. He had a sit-down interview with the Des Moines Register, and he said, well, that's great. We're thrilled, but we're just as thrilled if we get that approval from someone in Cedar Rapids.
Right. But you do a bigger happy dance when it's David Koch than.
Well, he has said he's going to spend,
Farmer Brown.
$900 million? Him and the network of Koch-affiliated organizations expect to spend about $900 million in this cycle. So I don't know how much the average Iowa voter spends, but I'm guessing not that much.
Probably not that much. Craig, you were with the governor a week ago or so in New Hampshire. How did he compare with the others? And do you get a flavor for how, in that key state, how he's faring with those average voters?
Yeah, I think he's doing okay. He's doing more than okay. I mean, in some of the polls he's leading in New Hampshire, you know, that doesn't mean a whole lot at this stage. But this wasn't an event like the one in Iowa back in January where, you know, he was like the star of the show and everybody agreed that he was the story, and he kind of catapulted out of Iowa with a ton of momentum, a ton of attention. This was there were 19, I think, potential Republican hopefuls speaking at this event. And, you know, a lot of the key ones were received fairly warmly by the crowd. Nobody necessarily stood out more than anyone else, but it was a good event for him because he, you know, continued to make a good impression, I think, with voters there. And, you know, there's just such a long way to go. You know, New Hampshire is going to be a lot about the commitment and the time that these people put in, you know, small venues and town hall meetings, and also what happens, you know, as they come out of Iowa. So I think he's doing fine, and I think he didn't do anything certainly to hurt himself.
It does mean
in New Hampshire.
It does mean one thing. It means that he doesn't have to announce that he's running yet, while these other campaigns need to do that to get some air and to get some media attention. He doesn't have to do that right now.
All right,
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's telling that the two candidates that have been, you know, delayed their announcements are Jeb Bush and Scott Walker, because they're doing well raising money and they're getting a lot of media attention.
All right, let's, before we close here, run through a couple of reader questions that have come in, and we'll try to zip through these a little pretty quickly. The first one, I'll throw to Dan. This is from someone, I love these names because I always try to figure out what they mean. Farg Dripper, who says, is the MJS coverage of the John Doe investigation over? Why haven't we been hearing more about the John Doe these days?
Well, it's mainly tied up in court, and there's also many other things going on. That's probably a reference to the National Review story on the raids, the John Doe raids, and you had people who talked anonymously to the National Review, and that's their story right now. But no, our coverage is not done.
Okay. We have a question here. Was one, I think it just came in from Jan Doe, not John Doe. Maybe it's spousal, sister, I don't know.
Mrs. Doe.
How would you feel about Sheriff David Clark running for mayor of Milwaukee?
I don't think it's something that he's really focused on or wants to do. I think he's enjoying being Fox News' celebrity of the year right now.
Okay, from John Casper, is using tax revenue from legalized marijuana a way to fund the new arena? Are we going to see legalized marijuana anytime soon, Mary?
You know, Governor Walker has not, he's not been a fan of legalized marijuana. He talked about that more recently on the campaign trail. I don't think we're going to see that anytime
I think
soon.
the answer is no.
Yeah.
But I guess that would make for an interesting arena.
It would. There are probably some sponsorship opportunities there that we could discuss off the air. This is one from YO, which may also be Yo, because we're maybe trying to get our attention. And I'll ask Dan this one. Does anyone really
Craig
care?
gets no questions.
Well, we got one for Craig coming up. Does anyone really care that they're getting a $5 drop in their property taxes so much that they support the massive cuts to nearly all the agencies of state and local government?
We'll find out in the next election, I guess.
That did not poll well, though.
It's not a night. Yeah, that's true. The Marquette poll showed just about everything you asked. The pushback is some of the people didn't like how the Marquette poll asked its questions, because if you ask somebody, do you favor this cut, almost always you get a no response to that. But.
All right, and one for Craig. This was via Twitter from RNEDEWA, which probably stands for something that I'm not picking up. It says if we've gone from number 11 to number 40, the shrinking middle class, huge racial disparity, 5,000 lost jobs, how can Scott Walker possibly think Wisconsin is a model for a national economy presidential platform?
Well, this ties into what we were just talking about, which is how his record and his popularity plays as he gets into the heart of the Republican debate. And so, the issue of job creation and the slow pace of job creation in Wisconsin, I think, is potentially an issue in the nominating fight. And if he were the nominee, it could be an issue in a general election. I mean, he's got things he can brag about, but you can't sort of ignore the fact that Wisconsin has been slow compared to other states in private sector job creation. And in fact, for the first time in the Marquette poll, a majority of voters said that was also their perception, that Wisconsin is lagging behind other states. So it's just something that the governor has to deal with when he makes his case about turning the state around. He has to sort of deal with the fact that the states had below average, and in some cases considerably below average, private sector job growth.
So you won't see the 250,000 job creation pledge anywhere on the presidential campaign trail.
We're going to have to leave it there. I was going to throw in a question about who will win first, the Bucks or the Brewers, and I thought that was kind of a little too loaded. But thanks everyone for joining us. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, please look for updates on the Scott Walker presidential front at our page, jsonline.com/Scott Walker, and we will see you next week. Thank you.